apologies if you missed last week's, but we had a slight issue with the equipment which has now been resolved. So you should be able to peruse this evening's session at your leisure. We're back in the book of Ezekiel again. And we're still in chapter 25. And we will be picking it up at verse 15. If you remember last week, we started to hear prophecies, the Lord prophesying against the nations around Judah and Jerusalem, for them to bear the consequences of what they had done to Jerusalem. So I'm going to read now verses 15 to 17. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah. Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I will cut off the Kerethites and destroy those remaining along the coast. I will carry out great vengeance on them and punish them in my wrath. Then they will know that I am the Lord when I take vengeance on them. Okay, so we've heard the prophecies against Moab and against Edom last week. Now we hear a prophecy against the Philistines. They're the next people to come under God's judgment. Now the Philistines are actually descended from Ham, who was Noah's son. It's also known as the Hamitic family line. So if you hear that word in future, you'll know what they're talking about now. The Hamitic family line. Ellicott has this to say about the whole thing. He says the historical books of the Old Testament are almost a continuous record of the hostility of the Philistines. At times they held the greater part of the land of Israel in subjection, and at times were subdued in their turn. Although belonging to another branch of the Hamitic family, their land was included in that of the Canaanites in the territory to be given to Israel. It was never, however, occupied by them, although the cities were fortified and garrisoned by some of the kings. This land lay along the coast, the Mediterranean coast, on the highway between Egypt and Assyria and Chaldea. Now, I suppose you've got to be familiar with a map of the area. Not only today's map, but an old map for that to make any sense. You know, we might just as well ask somebody where the Falklands was in the 1940s. Nobody would have had a clue. But you know, it's worth looking up, because it does add something to the Bible study when you can put a picture, even if it is only on a map, when you can put a picture to what you're reading, and it does add something to it. So I would encourage you to look up a map of it so you can put it all together. The Philistines, the Keel and Delitzsch Bible commentary of the Old Testament writes, the Philistines resembled the Edomites and the Ammonites in their disposition towards the covenant nation, the former in their thirst for revenge and the latter in their malicious rejoicing at Israel's fall. Don't you get the impression that perhaps Judah and Israel weren't all that popular with the countries around them? There's nobody saying, oh my goodness, I'm so upset Israel's fallen, the city Judah's gone. Everybody's rejoicing. Yes, they've gone, they've been taken. Jerusalem is no more. The Philistines were a powerful people. They were never dispossessed by the Israelites, and they were a thorn in their side all throughout history. And they, like everybody else, have joined in attacking Jerusalem and Israel in its time of trouble. And so they've fallen under God's judgment. God accuses them also of having revenge in their hearts. In essence, God is saying that they have allowed this long-standing hostility between them and Israel to cause this malice in their hearts and to lead them to look for revenge. But not only to look for revenge, but to do it in a nasty, spiteful way as well. Now, if you're paying attention when you read this, you'll have seen they threw in the name Kerethites as well in the middle of the sentence. Now, I wondered where they came from. There must be a reason for them to be in there, but where did they come from? As this seems to be, as far as I can tell, the first time they're mentioned in Ezekiel. But the more I looked into it, it seems that not too much is known about them, to be honest. They're known as the Kerethites with a K, but they're also called the Cherethites with a CH in front of it, which means, incidentally, executioners. That appears 9 times in the King James Bible, and the other name that's tucked in there, the Pelethites, which means couriers or messengers, showed up 7 times, and they're often paired together. Now, as I looked into this, some experts say they were Philistine in origin. Some say they were from Crete, possibly even some part Hebrew. Some scholars have suggested that the name Kerethite was an alternative name for Philistines. We don't really know, the truth be known, but what we do know is they lived in the south of their country on the Mediterranean coast. But you may not realize this, but whatever their identification, they have a known association with King David. They were mercenary soldiers who probably began to attach themselves to David while he was an outlaw, running away from the king. And they subsequently became the king's bodyguard and started to form the nucleus of his army. They seem to have been especially active in times of crisis to David, remaining loyal to him throughout. They went with him when he fled from Absalom. They pursued Sheba after his rebellion. And when Adonijah tried to succeed King as David, it was the Kerethites and the Pelethites who formed the bodyguard for Solomon's anointing. That left me asking the question, well, why have they incurred God's wrath? And I couldn't answer it. No matter how hard I looked, I could not answer that question. So we just have to assume that somewhere along the line things have gone wrong. With the rest of the Philistines, they've done something that has incurred God's wrath. Taking part in Jerusalem's fall, rejoicing over it, whatever. It's likely they're on the list because they've gone along with the rest of the Philistines. It might be a generational thing for all we know. Don't forget, we're several generations on from David now, I know that parents teach their kids to hate what they hate. Perhaps parents have taught their kids to go along with the Philistine way of life, then they taught their kids to go along with it. And over the years, perhaps this identification with David has been watered down and filtered out, and that's why they've ended up, if I can put it like this, on God's hit list. But whatever, they have also incurred the wrath of God, and they're going to be punished as well. So the Moabites, the Edomites, the Philistines, and all the heathen nations around Judah all thought that this was the end. Jerusalem is gone. Judah is ruined. Jehovah's power is gone. His integrity is gone. This is it. It's all over. We've won. And if you think back to last week, I mentioned something called the Moabite stone. If you remember, this was a stone that was found in one of the cities that talks, inscribed on it, was all about the attack against Jerusalem and all the rest of it. It was all mentioned on there. And if you need any corroboration of the way they've behaved, just look at the stone. It boasts of the king of Moab, that his god Chemosh has vanquished Israel, and that the God of Israel has been defeated. Of course, we know that's rubbish, because our God is never defeated. But they're having their moment of smugness, if you like, self-satisfaction. They think they've won. And this, was precisely the development that God is addressing as Ezekiel speaks forth these prophecies. The prophecies that will result in the execution of God's wrath upon all these pagan nations. God is, if you like, defending his reputation. He's defending his standing as the only true God. He's letting these people, these nations around who think it's all over, know that it's not all over. I'm still here. I haven't gone away, and I'm still more powerful than your gods. God is defending, if you like, his reputation and his standing, and these actions that he's taken alone is the only thing that could have defended his reputation. Don't forget, human nature hasn't changed one iota. I know I get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it again anyway. Sometimes human nature is such that barbaric, if I can use the word, punishments are needed to keep people in check, because sometimes that's the only language some people understand. And this is the case with these nations around Jerusalem. They're not going to take anybody's word for it that God is still there. They're not going to take anybody's word for it that he's still more powerful than their gods. They're going to have to be shown. And this prophecies that Ezekiel is speaking out, God is showing these nations that he's still there. He is showing them that he is boss, and that what he says will happen.
And so it will be at the end as well, when they all rise up to the nations.
Amen.
You'll show them who's boss.
Amen. Absolutely. The Cambridge Bible for schools and colleges says this: Israel occupies a place of universal significance in the history of the world, for it is the people of Jehovah who is God alone. He who is God alone has become God of Israel, and it is through Israel that he is known to the nations, and through Israel and her history that he will fully reveal himself to the people of the world.
Amen.
This perfect manifestation of himself will be seen in Israel's restoration, when his glory shall be revealed and all flesh shall see it together. But this restoration of Israel cannot be without great judgments on the nations who have hitherto harassed her or seduced her. These judgments will awaken the nations to the knowledge who is the God of Israel is. They will know that he is Jehovah, and they will ensure that in future his people will not be troubled or led astray. And God says at the end of that chapter, then they will know that I am the Lord when I take vengeance on them. And isn't this what it's all about? It's about they will know that I am the Lord. Everything that God is doing is designed to tear this nastiness out of his people and to restore them to who they were, but also to show the nations around Israel that he is the God. And once he set Israel back on the right path again, they are to be the guide, if you like, as to how we should live. They are to be the shining light that tells people, all the nations all around, that God is the Lord. And one day they will know that he is the Lord. Okay, let's go on to chapter 26, and I'm going to read the first 4 verses. In the 11th year, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, Aha, the gate to the nation is broken, and its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper. Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, O Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you, like the sea casting up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. I will scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. That's pretty definite, isn't it? There's no mistaking what's coming there. Now then, this chapter begins with another date. Once again, we've seen Ezekiel record, well, part of a specific date anyway, the 11th year on the first day of the month. Now, although he doesn't actually give a month here, most scholars agree that the events coming in chapter 26 are approximately 14 months on from the start of chapter 24. So we've got a timeline now. You go back and read chapter 24, and when you get to chapter 26 that we're looking tonight, there's a difference of about 14 months between the two. From when the parable, if you remember, when he gave the parable of the cooking pot and the meat and all that, from that parable to where we start now at chapter 26 with the prophecy against Tyre, the experts say is approximately 14 months. Now, as we'll find out as we go through it, the whole of chapter 26 is given over to prophecies against the city of Tyre. And most commentators believe these prophecies regarding Tyre were given shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, simply because they focus on Tyre's joy at the fall of Jerusalem. Now, Tyre, for those who don't know, was a great ancient city of the Phoenicians, located on the Mediterranean north coast in what is today Lebanon. Tyre and her sister city Sidon, which was about 20 miles north of Tyre, were important seaports for the whole region in their day. Tyre, you could say, to the world of her age was what Venice was in the Middle Ages and, let's say, London is today. They were important seaports. And the Phoenicians, by the way, were a strong seafaring nation. They had a good navy, and they carried their vessels carried goods around the world, the known world, even, believe it or not, to the coasts of Cornwall. So they were sending goods far and wide. They had a strong navy. And in the days of Ezekiel, it was a populous and proud city. And if you want to look it up, you can see about this city for the first time in Joshua chapter 19. So here in Ezekiel, we see Tyre accused of rejoicing in Israel's downfall. But notice here, there's no hint of any religious animosity here. There's no hint of any spiteful or malicious behavior towards Jerusalem. It seems to be simply a commercial thing. That Israel, Jerusalem in the days of Solomon was a great commercial centre. The inland trade routes from Arabia and India all went through Jerusalem. We've said earlier in the study that it's no accident that God put Jerusalem where he did, because it was literally right in the centre of things. And it was an important commercial centre. Even people from Egypt and the Hittites all had trade had to go through Jerusalem. It must have been the centre of many transactions between a lot of nations. And that is what Tyre is celebrating. There's no religious or spitefulness there. They're simply saying, now Jerusalem has gone, we can have all the trade. Because the city no longer exists, they've got to come to us instead. We can now monopolise the situation. They said, we can make ourselves rich, is basically what they're saying. Anything that was important, that made Israel great, that made Jerusalem a great city, will now make us a great city. In other words, God is saying, Tyre was guilty of saying, oh good, now Jerusalem is out the way, we can cash in on all the trade. Rubbing their hands. Again, going back to the Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges, the idea appears to be that Jerusalem, or Judah, was a door barring the entrance to Tyre, which being broken and turned inward or openwards, Tyre, the nations would stream with their commerce towards her. The kingdom of Judah lay across the great commercial routes from the south, and no doubt intercepted much of the merchandise that otherwise would have reached Tyre, and probably exacted custom on that which was allowed to pass. The natural sense of the door of the nations would be a door into the nations, and the idea would be that the door was now open for Tyre to enter. In other words, the obstacle which stands between Tyre and all these riches of all the other nations is now out of the way because Jerusalem has fallen. But you know, once again, there's a hint of sadness here if you think about it, because this strong opposition was not always the policy of Tyre towards Jerusalem. Hiram, who was a king of Tyre, was a friend of King David. And he helped David and later Solomon in providing supplies and expertise in the building of the temple. And if you're writing references, there's a couple here for you to look up there. It's 1 Kings chapter 5 verses 1 to 12. 1 Chronicles chapter 14 verse 1. And 2 Chronicles chapter 2 verses 3 and 11. So Tyre and Israel were once good friends. But they seem to have drifted apart, as friends do, I guess as countries do. and seems to have happened during the reign of Ahab. And Ahab unwisely made a marriage alliance for the daughter of the Phoenician king, named in the Bible as Ethbaal, which means with Baal. And that's 1 Kings chapter 16, if you want to look that up. This lady, Ethbaal, was of course the infamous Jezebel, who was an aggressive promoter of the worship of the Tyrian god, also known as Baal. And she was a vicious opponent of the God of Israel. And that seems to be where the relationship between the two kind of drifted apart. After this point in history, after this marriage alliance, the good relations enjoyed by Tyre and the people of Judah soured. The prophet Joel accused the people of Tyre and Sidon of selling the people of Judah into slavery to the Greeks. And so, having laid out exactly what Tyre has been guilty of, Ezekiel now tells them that the God of Israel is against them because of this, that he will bring many nations against them, which will be like the waves of the sea crashing against them. God will cause their walls and towers to be pulled down, and the rubble will be scraped away, leaving only bare rock. Now, those of us who've seen a storm, that doesn't take much imagination to imagine waves and waves of troops coming against this city like a storm. It must have seemed relentless. It must have terrified the people who lived in the city for sure. So I'm going to pick it up now and read verses 5 and verses 6. Out into the sea she will become a place to spread fishing nets, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. She will become plunder for the nations, and her settlements on the mainland will be ravaged by the sword. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Once again, we see God's focus here on letting them know that he is God, that he is still around. Now, the city of Tyre, in case you didn't know, was built in two parts. There was the mainland city, but there was also a little island just offshore, which was also part of the city of Tyre. It was famous for its remarkably secure defences, especially that bit on the island, which was kind of almost impregnable. And when the main city on the land was threatened, they all retreated into this little fortress on the island, and they could stay relatively safe. Nevertheless, God promises that one day many nations are going to come against them, as unstoppable as the waves of the sea. God prophesies that Tyre will be completely destroyed, so completely that the offshore island will become a place for fishermen to spread their nets. And the main city will be ravaged by the sword, become plunder for the nations before being razed to the ground and scraped bare. Ellicott says, the spreading of nets, such has been the chief use of insular Tyre for ages, and although a miserable village of 3,000 people has sprung up, chiefly within the present century, upon part of the site, other parts have still no more use. The Tyre upon the mainland has so utterly disappeared that even its site cannot now be identified. And this total destruction has been confirmed by travellers in the 17th and 18th century who've made records and recorded seeing fishermen laying down their nets on this site where the city of Tyre once stood. It doesn't always come true straight away, we know that. Sometimes God makes you wait, but you can bet your life what he says is going to happen. Okay, I'm going to read verses 7 to 11. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. From the north I am going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army. He will ravage your settlements on the mainland with the sword. He will set up siege works against you, build a ramp up to your walls, and raise his shields against you. He will direct the blows of his battering rams against your walls and demolish your towers with his weapons. His horses will be so many that they will cover you with dust. Your walls will tremble at the noise of war horses, wagons and chariots when he enters your gates as men enter a city whose walls have been broken through. The hoofs of his horses will trample all your streets. He will kill your people with the sword, and your strong pillars will fall to the ground. Okay, once again, Ezekiel is at pains here to make sure that people know this is not him talking. And he starts this off with, once again, let them know this is what the sovereign Lord says, so that they know that this is God. And Ezekiel here goes into some detail as to what's going to happen. God is going to set Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, against this city. He's going to come against it with chariots and horses and a great, massive army. We said the army, as it comes towards the city, is going to decimate the settlements around it. We read that when they get to the city, this city itself is going to disappear under a cloud of dust because there's so many horses. I guess in order to understand that, you need to have been in that area and seen a dust storm, really. But if you've ever seen them on television, you know, that must take a lot of horses to create a dust storm that big. We read that when the city falls, the horses' hoofs are going to trample in the streets. Do you know, if God's plan is to frighten the life out of people before they come, he's certainly working. Because if you believe that what God says comes true, then this has got to frighten you to death. You know, and we've seen this again before, actually against Jerusalem with the battering rams and the horses and the chariots. So Nebuchadnezzar is obviously carrying out here a well-rehearsed plan. Every time he takes a city, this is part of the plan. He probably does it the same way. The horses, the chariots, the battering rams, they're all used to it by now, and it would have worked like clockwork. It gives us, though, a picture of chaos and terror. As we read through the description of what's going to happen, we read, your strong pillars will fall to the ground. Now, these pillars spoken of were, they believe, actually obelisks. And they were mentioned by the historian Herodotus as erected in the temple of Heracles at the city of Tyre. One was of gold and the other one was of emerald, which shone brightly at night. And they were dedicated to Melkarth, who was the god of Tyre. And so we read these impressive pillars are going to be destroyed by the enemy. I'm just going to read verse 12 now. They will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and demolish your fine houses and throw your stones, timber and rubble into the sea. Now we know that this siege did take place because a cuneiform tablet was discovered in 1926 by a German archaeologist called Eckhard Unger. And on that tablet it discussed food provisions for the king and his soldiers as they marched against the city of Tyre. And other cuneiform tablets discovered also confirm that Tyre came under the control of Nebuchadnezzar at some point during his reign. But what is not immediately apparent by reading the book of Ezekiel is who actually razed the city to the ground. Now, if you take this chapter at face value, you can be left with the impression that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city of Tyre. But this is not the case, apparently. Now, what we don't immediately pick up from Ezekiel's prophecy is that although God did send Nebuchadnezzar against the city of Tyre, it's not him who actually flattened the city, destroying it completely. Now, we know from historians that the siege Nebuchadnezzar put against Tyre lasted 13 years. And after these 13 years, the Tyrians negotiated a surrender with the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar was never able to take control of the city by military means. It was left. The result of the siege was militarily inconclusive. Now, something that's not immediately obvious to the casual reader of the Bible, but it's there if you pick it up, if you look at it and study it. There's a subtle but significant difference between verses 7 to 11 and verses 12 to 14. Now, in verses 7 to 11, the destruction is described as the effect of a he. That is Nebuchadnezzar. But starting at verse 12, the destruction comes at the hands of they, indicating many invaders. And if you think back to verse 3 at the beginning of this chapter, God mentions that he will send many nations against the city of Tyre. Now, Tyre has been conquered and ruled over by the Greeks, the Persians, the Romans, the Crusaders, and the Arabs. that's been destroyed again and again. So Nebuchadnezzar is one of the many nations that's referenced in verse 3 that have come against this city over the years. And although Nebuchadnezzar did significant damage to the city, as we read in the prophecy, and is evidenced by the fact that verse 9 tells us he demolished these towers or these obelisks. It was actually Alexander the Great who first tore down this city completely. We read in verse 12 that the city's wealth will be plundered and that the walls will be broken down, its fine houses demolished and the timber and rubble thrown into the sea. This part of the prophecy was fulfilled by Alexander. He actually took the timber, stones and the rubbish, etc. of the old city of Tyre and filled up the space between the mainland and the island stronghold of Tyre so he could get his troops across there to this little island fortress and take it. Okay, let's read verses 13 and 14. I will put an end to your noisy songs, and the music of your harps will be heard no more. I will make you a bare rock, and you will become a place to spread fishing nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, declare it. I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. So once again, there's a difference in wording between verse 12. In verse 12 we read, they will. And here we read, I will. Now God is speaking of his own direct action. He is declaring, if you like, that all these calamities are being ordered by him. God says, I will put an end to your noisy music and songs. And like a lot of countries in those times, music was an important part in the Phoenicians' life, not only for pleasure, but part of their worship as well. And the God of Israel says he's going to bring an end to it all. And he repeats his earlier promise that it would become a bare rock for fishermen to spread their nets on, and it will never be rebuilt. John Gill puts it like this: as this city abounded with riches, so with carnal mirth and pleasure. It was a joyous city. The inhabitants lived merrily and jovially, were given to much music, which was very diverting and amusing to foreigners that traded with them. But now it would be all over with them. There would be no more songs, nor any to sing them, and the sound of the harps shall be no more heard. That's quite a sobering thing if you think about it, mind. A bustling city full of music, full of joviality, and then I guess it's a bit like if you're the only person that goes to a castle in our country today, and you're on your own standing there, and you imagine the place was once a bustling hive of activity, and yet here you are all alone amongst the ruins. That's probably what it must have seemed like after the city of Tyre was demolished. Okay, read verses 15 to 18. This is what the sovereign Lord says to Tyre. Will not the coastlands tremble at the sound of your fall, when the wounded groan and the slaughter takes place in you? Then all the princes of the coast will step down from their thrones and lay aside their robes and take off their embroidered garments. Clothed with terror, they will sit on the ground, trembling every moment, appalled at you. Then they will take up a lament concerning you and say to you, how you are destroyed, O city of renown, peopled by men of the sea. You were a power on the seas, you and your citizens. You put your terror on all who lived there. Now the coastlands tremble on the day of your fall. The islands in the sea are terrified at your collapse. So God is revealing here that the towns and cities around Tyre are going to tremble when they hear of the overthrow of the city. The news is going to spread far and wide. The news of this destruction is going to cause a panic, a great commotion in all the colonies and islands connected with Tyre and all the countries around. And there were many cities and colonies along the coast and amongst the islands that depended upon Tyre for their prosperity and their protection. And Tyre in case you didn't know, had colonies in many of the Mediterranean coastal regions, including Cyprus, Rhodes, Malta, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, and even in Africa. So they had quite a large empire, a powerful seagoing nation. And you can imagine now that all these are going to start trembling when they hear that Tyre has fallen and been razed. We hear that the noise of the battle and the cries of the wounded are going to be heard around the place. The rulers of these communities would go into mourning and they must be fearful for what has taken place in their mother city, if you like. The city they've depended on for their trade and commerce is gone. So they're facing financial ruin, if you like. But more than that, their protection is gone. And if Tyre has fallen, that mighty city was to stop the conquerors from coming against them next. Now, they're called princes, these people along the coast, but scholars believe that they weren't really princes, but rather they're merchant princes, important people who've grown into positions of importance because of their trade. And if you want to read this, you can pick it up in Isaiah chapter 23 and verse 8. And I read, "Who planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants are princes, whose traders are renowned in the earth?" So we're saying that these princes that are mentioned are not actually princes and leaders of the country, but more important financial people, traders. They will step down from their thrones. And again, that can be a bit misleading because scholars believe the word thrones here is not a throne. It's any special chair that these important traders choose to use as their sitting. And you can pick that up, if you like, as a simile in 1 Samuel, where we read that Eli was sitting on his chair by the side of the road. That was probably one of the temple's, if you like, important chairs, if I can put it like that. And so the thrones that they were referring to were simply important chairs that these leaders of commerce used to sit in, to do their business. If you like, their office chair, if you want to put it like that. Stepping down from their thrones is representative of their neglecting their business, temporarily ceasing to trade. Taking their robes and their embroidered garments off is a representative of them going into mourning. So they've seen this event, Tyre being destroyed, as so important that they're stopping their trade for a bit. They're taking their clothes off. They're actually going into mourning because this city has been destroyed. But you know, we shouldn't make the mistake of believing that they're going into mourning because of what's happened to Tyre. Rather, they're going into mourning for themselves because they've seen their wealthy, cushy lifestyle disappearing down the pan with Tyre. And also, they're fearful because they may be next. We're told that they're shaken violently because they're terrified. David Guzik says this in his commentary: "The princes of those other cities on the Mediterranean coast would humble themselves in great fear that the same destruction would come upon them." And who can blame them, really? You know, because we were talking about brutal times back then. Armies that conquered your city, there was no mercy given. You were in the way, you were butchered. That's it. And they were rightly fearful because they didn't know whether or not Alexander and Nebuchadnezzar were going to stop at the city. For all they knew, he was after all of their lands. He might have gone right down the coast, destroying all of these nations as he went. And they're terrified because of that. Verse 17 tells us they took up a lament concerning Tyre. Now, a lament is to express deep regret or grief or sorrow through these words and actions of a song. Matthew Poole comments that they would be solemnly and heartily upset for many days and bewail the city. Or rather, as I suspect, the loss of their own income and source of trade. So we should bear in mind, like I said, that businessmen and women of the time were probably not much different to businessmen and women of today. They wouldn't have been too concerned about the city going. They're more concerned about the loss of their income, their nice cushy lifestyle and opportunities to make money disappearing before their eyes. And although we don't read this or hear of it, I wouldn't imagine it's too long when the dust had settled before they started approaching Alexander to put out new tentacles and find new ways of making money. Interestingly enough, here's another outlook on it, if you like, and that is penned by the American Christian clergyman and Bible teacher Warren W. Wiersbe. And he writes, in Ezekiel 26, 17 and 18, we have a brief lamentation over the fall of the city. Keep in mind that in ancient days, the prophets sometimes used funeral laments in a satirical manner to poke fun at the enemies of God. So are we reading here something that is really happening? Or are we simply reading Ezekiel being sarcastic? I guess we'll never know.
And also, in the Revelation 18, with Babylon falling, the commercial system is scary. It can encroach on even today, can it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I'm just going to read from verse 19 until the end of the chapter. This is what the sovereign Lord says. When I make you a desolate city, like cities no longer inhabited, and when I bring you the ocean depths over you, and its vast waters cover you, then I will bring you down with those who go down to the pit, to the people of long ago. I will make you dwell in the earth below, as in ancient ruins, with those who have gone down to the pit. You will not return or take your place in the land of the living. I will bring you to a horrible end, and you will be no more. You will be sought, but you will never again be found, declares the sovereign Lord. Strong words, eh? I will make you a desolate city. Alexander's conquest brought an end, a permanent end to the Phoenician Empire. And from that point on, the Phoenician city of Tyre ceased to exist. And let's be honest, a city can't be any more desolate or uninhabited than the one is not there anymore. But God also says, I will bring the ocean depths over you, and its vast waters will cover you. Now, if you think about it, when Alexander took the land-waste city of Tyre, he used the rubble from that destruction to fill in the gap between the mainland and the island. That's bringing the water over the city. Not exactly like a tidal wave, but nevertheless the city is now underwater. When he tossed the remains of mainland Tyre into the sea to build this land bridge that helped him conquer the island part of Tyre and effectively put the landward part of the city underwater, I believe this fulfilled the prophecy of Ezekiel for the city to become underwater. I'm nearly done. Then I will bring you down like those who go to the pit. Ezekiel here talks about going down to the pit, and that's a common way, as I'm sure we all know, of referring to the grave. When he speaks of dwelling in the lowest part of the earth, he wasn't speaking geographically like the Dead Sea is the lowest part around the area. He's speaking metaphorically, if you like. We're talking about the realm of the dead. The whole inference of this verse 20 is that the city of Tyre will cease to exist. The people will die, will be like those who die and go down to the pit and are buried, never to return to the land of the living. This city is going to be destroyed so completely that there will not be any ruins at all left to identify it or mark its location. And even today, we can only roughly guess at where the city might have stood, but there's nothing left for us to pinpoint the rubble and say this is where the city stood. And don't forget, God talked about scraping after the rubble had gone. Well, isn't that exactly what Alexander did? Not only did he throw the rubble, the bricks and the wood into the sea, but he scraped the land as well to fill it in, to make the dust, to get the dirt on top of the rubble to make a solid road. Now, Ezekiel also talks in these last ends about the land of the living. And Matthew Henry has an interesting take on this phrase. And he writes, see how the irreparable ruin of Tyre is aggravated by the prospect of the restoration of Israel. Thus shall Tyre sink when I shall set glory in the land of the living. Now the holy land is the land of the living, for none but holy souls are properly living souls, where living sacrifices are offered to the living God, and where the lively oracles are, there the land of the living is. There David hoped to see the goodness of the Lord. That was a type of heaven, which indeed the land of the living. Though this land of the living may for a time lie under disgrace, yet God will again set glory in it. The glory that had departed shall return, and the restoration of what they had been deprived of shall be much more, so much more their glory. God himself will be the glory of the lands that are the lands of the living. It will aggravate the misery of those that have their portion in the land of the dying, of those that are forever dying, to behold the happiness of those at the same time that shall have their everlasting portion in the land of the living. So he's making a division there between the land of the dead and the land of the living, the people of Israel, if you like, and the people of the city of Tyre. And I'll just finish now with this comment. There is indeed, some of you might know, a city called Tyre today, but that is in modern-day Lebanon. It might be sitting roughly on the same spot where the old city lay, but like I said, we don't know for sure where the old city was. But this is not the Phoenician city of Tyre that haunted the Jews and gloated over their downfall. That city is gone and will never come back again, nor the people that lived in it. This is another city that has been renamed after Tyre. The city that Ezekiel was prophesying against, just as God prophesied, has been erased, leveled to the ground, never to be found again. It doesn't exist anymore. And I'm going to end it there for tonight.